The climate of planet Earth is changing. The natural order is being turned upside down. Millions of people are at risk. Global warming takes centre stage. A crucial UN climate summit is about to get underway here in Qatar. I'm Nick Clark, and welcome to part one of this Al Jazeera special. In the coming days, the world will attempt to re-engage in the battle against climate change at a key United Nations conference in Doha. We're here in the heart of the Arabian Gulf, a region awash with fossil fuels. Oil giant Saudi Arabia is just across the water there, and Iran, with its vast reserves of oil and gas, 200 kilometers in that direction. And what's underneath these sands helps make Qatar a major player in energy exports, all helping fuel the CO2 emissions that most scientists agree are putting mankind on a highly dangerous course. Coming up in the program, I'll speak to award-winning environmentalist David Suzuki and Nigel Lawson, one of the leading voices calling for less action on climate change because he doesn't entirely believe the science. And we'll take you to the furthest points of the planet to see just how people's lives are changing. From here in the desert to the Qatari capital, we will of course be in Doha, the host of this year's climate change talks. Nearly 200 nations will be attending the 18th annual conference to assess what progress has been made in dealing with global warming. But first up, just how is the climate changing?
Across our planet, scientists say the temperature is rising. And the weather is getting wilder.
Oh my gosh! It's another killer tornado!
Powerful storms are tearing through our towns, swamping ever greater swathes of land. And we are tearing down the trees that keep the air clean. More and more evidence suggests we're trapping the sun's heat in the Earth's atmosphere. It is parching land, depriving it of the water it needs and that we need. The creatures which share our Earth face new challenges. Our oceans are warming. Coral is dying, disrupting food chains. The ice that caps our Earth, north and south, is breaking down. Our seas may rise further and swallow land. The problems are piling up. They can't be swept away or buried. How we manage our changing climate, our own planet, will determine our future.
Well, let's hear now from David Suzuki, a Canadian environmentalist and a global leader in the battle against climate change. We spoke to him from our studios here in Qatar.
When I first began to talk about climate change, which was in 1988, when climatologists meeting in Toronto said this represents a threat to human survival, second only to all-out nuclear war, and they called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's when I first began to get interested in this. At that time, I said, this is a slow-motion catastrophe. I was more interested in clear-cut logging and depletion of the oceans, and I thought that we could wait decades before we did anything about climate change. What has surprised me is that with only a 0.7 degree rise, we are now seeing absolutely monumental impacts in ecosystems around the world, including in the ocean, the change in fish, the movement of species up towards the Arctic Ocean. We're seeing an impact.
But let me just go to these talks, these climate talks here in Doha. How hopeful are you that there will be any substantive action here in Doha?
I'm not. As I don't have much hope for the meetings that we're in Rio in June of this year. The problem is very simple. Human beings think they're so smart and so important. We put our priorities, that is our political boundaries, our constructs like corporations and the economy and the market and capitalism, we elevate that above ecology. Ecology is this discipline that looks at what the conditions, the principles, and the laws are that regulate species' ability to survive and flourish. Now, I would have thought any intelligent creature would say we've got to put what ecologists are finding at the highest priority we've got.
Okay, when you say look at nature, what do you mean? What would you do to mitigate climate change?
I'm saying that climate is determined by obviously the concentration of carbon, the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, and they have equilibrated over many, many centuries. We know in the past there are changes, significant changes that are correlated with temperature and climate. So if we want to try to retain some kind of stability and not go into climate chaos, then obviously we've got to pay attention to the amount of carbon we have put into the atmosphere and reduce it then to a level that can give us some sustainability. We're not doing that.
What do you think will happen if nothing is done?
Well, I have no idea. I listen to the scientists. We talk about, the calving of the great ice sheets from Greenland and Antarctica, which will, when they fall into the oceans, begin to rise not just in centimeters, but in meters, and that's imminent. We've seen the change in glaciers that are being rapidly depleted. What the impact of this will be on the water cycles, on the carbon cycles, and on the nitrogen cycle, we have no idea. But we know that we're disrupting some of these great cycles, and the stability of the planet has been radically disrupted. Certainly, just from warming, we know that water expands. So thermal expansion of the oceans is inevitable as we begin to warm the planet. We're getting radical change in the Arctic in terms of the melting, the shorter periods of snowfall and freezing. The ice sheets are thinner each summer. We're absorbing more heat into the... We don't know what's going to happen. We can have all kinds of models, but we are disrupting the great heat and cold engines of the planet. The consequences are unpredictable.
Doha, the Qatari capital, a city that's shot up on the back of vast gas reserves. Where once there was little more than a ramshackle pearl fishing town, now a sprawling metropolis in the desert, powering, transporting, watering and feeding a nation of nearly 2 million people. They say that Qatar has one of the worst carbon footprints in the world per capita, and yet it's hosting the globe's biggest and most important climate change conference. How did that happen? Here's Tarek Bazley.
Each year, billions of cubic metres of gas is pumped from Qatar's North Field, liquefied and then shipped abroad. It's the mainstay of the economy and the source of its extraordinary wealth. But Qatar's cheap natural gas is also used to generate electricity and desalinate water. Some of that water is used to green the desert, a daily soaking to keep grass and plants alive in summer temperatures that can top 50 degrees Celsius. Transforming Qatar's harsh natural environment into a green, lush garden like this is a gas-guzzling exercise. Qataris get free power and water, and it's highly subsidised for everyone else. As a result, people here are among the highest consumers of both electricity and water in the world. Qatar's small population, rapid growth and big carbon footprint means it's ranked as the world's worst carbon dioxide emitter by population, though it only contributes 0.25% of the world's emissions.
In most countries in the Middle East, energy is still incredibly cheap. That makes it pretty unattractive to actually use energy more efficiently. So clearly, one of the things that we need to see is movement on proper energy pricing.
At this year's climate talks, countries are being urged to sign up to binding cuts to their greenhouse gas emissions.
We are fully aware of the perils the world is facing as a result of climate change, and the UN Climate Change Conference will address the direct impact of climate change on food security. We hope the conference will produce tangible results and reinforce international cooperation.
Qatar has invested in green technologies like these experimental solar panels. It's also taken steps to reduce the practice of gas flaring or burning off excess gas. Along with desalination, flaring is a major contributor to its emissions. Qatar wants to lead the world in investing in new green technology, but that's the easy bit. Chairing such a divisive and important climate change conference will be a more difficult and complex challenge. Tarek Basley, Al Jazeera, Doha.
All populations that live at sea level are under threat from climate change, from here in the Gulf to the Pacific, where island nations like Kiribati, the Maldives, Micronesia, the Philippines and the Solomon Islands could become completely submerged. Coastal populations are all at risk in countries like India, China, Indonesia and Bangladesh, from where Nicholas Hack now reports on a community of climate refugees.
These children are attending school, but it's not just any school. Theirs is on a boat. All of them are climate refugees, forced to move from their homes due to rising waters. According to UN agencies, floods and torrential rains destroyed thousands of schools last year.
I don't want my grandchildren to rely on nature's goodwill to survive. They need to get an education so that they can leave this land.
The school is funded by a local charity. The goal is to ensure that the children still get a basic education. 8-year-old Shaun wants to become an engineer. He says he wants to build a wall to protect Bangladesh from floods.
By the time these school children become adults, 1/3 of Bangladesh's territory will be permanently flooded.
The Himalayan glaciers, source of all major rivers in Bangladesh. But because of rising temperatures, those glaciers are melting at an unprecedented rate. This, along with deforestation of the Indian subcontinent, causes the rivers downstream to overflow. And as Bangladesh is a low-lying delta, on average just 1 meter above sea level, people's homes and livelihoods are being destroyed. Under these waters is an entire village. Seasonal floods and torrential monsoon rains gradually wiped it off the map. All those old enough have moved away to find work. The young and the elderly have stayed on. Fazlur Rahman and his 2 grandchildren now live on a boat, floating above what once was their village.
Wherever I find space, I set up my home, but the floods keep submerging the land and destroying it, and I keep moving. I'm fed up with this.
As developed countries continue to pollute the air with carbon dioxide, global temperatures are predicted to rise by 4 degrees. These children face a future floating on water. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, Nator, Bangladesh.
Life on the rising waters of Bangladesh. But what about the rest of the world? Take a look at this.
Donc, regardez cet espace par rapport à la désertification.
In the 60s, this entire space was green, from here all the way to the foot of those mountains. All of it was filled with nomads and life. There were forests and wild animals, birds and antelope. This is total desertification. Everything has been exterminated.
This water comes from the springs that are fed by the glaciers. If the water is gone, we will all have to leave.
There was water 7 to 8 meters deep, full of lobsters and carps. Now our crops have dropped. There is no humidity and it rains very little now.
Every year, parts of the world are hit with devastating natural disasters. This year, weeks of torrential rain, flooding and landslides killed over 50 people across the Philippines in August. Drought struck the Sahel region of Africa. Lack of rain saw crops fail and livestock starve. In November, the east coast of the United States was battered by Hurricane Sandy. The storm hit 12 states. Well, we're joined now by Al Jazeera's meteorologist Steph GAULTER. And Steph, the question is, we're seeing this big bad weather going on, but is it right to say that the weather is changing around the world?
Well, just because you see weather in a few places change doesn't mean necessarily that globally climate is changing, because they're 2 very different things. One's weather and one's climate. So, for example, Qatar, our climate is a desert climate. I mean, what have you seen travelling around Qatar?
It's been pretty hot on the whole, and cooling down slightly as we're coming into winter, I guess, but on the whole it's been pretty hot.
and that's predominantly our weather. It's hot and sunny. But that's not the only weather that we get in Qatar. We have sandstorms.
We have rain as well.
Exactly, usually from thunderstorms, and also some hail every now and then as well. So that's the weather, and that's not necessarily the same as the climate.
So does that mean that, although we're seeing these big bad weather events, the climate isn't changing around the world? Is that what you're saying?
No, just that weather and climate are different things. So just because one weather event has happened doesn't necessarily mean that the climate is changing. What you would notice, though, if the climate was changing, is that there will be more big bad weather events, and that is what we're seeing. In fact, I've got this graph here that shows the weather and the climate over the globe, how it's changed over the last 150 years.
Right.
You can see it's not a straight line. It's got all sorts of little kinks in it. And this little dip here, that might be when there's a La Nina event in the Pacific. That's when the Pacific waters are just a bit cooler than usual. And this little bump here, that could be due to something like the solar activity being more than usual, because every 11 years there's a solar cycle. So every 11 years we see more power from the sun. Yeah. So there's all sorts of things that would happen that would affect our climate.
Right, so up and down, but generally you can see the trend is up.
That's right. And that's the concern, because although all the natural wiggles are in there, the overall trend is upwards, and that's what we've seen.
All right, Steph, well, that's the science. Not everybody believes the science. And we spoke to the former UK Finance Minister, Nigel Lawson. Have a listen to what he had to say.
The figures which show quite clearly that there has been no global warming so far this century, in the first 12 years of this century. They also show that during the last quarter of the last century, there was a very slight global warming, and it is likely that man-made emissions of carbon dioxide played a part, but scientists are uncertain as to how large a part that was.
We've still seen a record Arctic sea ice retreat this year. We've seen big weather events like Hurricane Sandy and so forth. There are climate refugees in Bangladesh. The Inuit people are seeing wholesale changes. Climate change, global warming is happening right now, and people, mankind, are feeling its effects, aren't they?
No. As I say, there's been no recorded global warming so far this century. What people are concerned about, and I understand that some people are concerned, what people are concerned about is what might happen in the future. But at the moment, there is nothing peculiar happening at all. You say that Arctic ice has been retreating. Arctic ice increases and diminishes and so on. What has actually been happening is that while Arctic ice in recent years has been retreating, the Antarctic ice has been actually growing and expanding.
But we're seeing a record sea ice retreat this year as far as the Arctic is concerned. But the thing is, overall, we have scientific consensus, or as near as we can get it. We have scientific consensus as near as we can get it, that the picture is much worse than you're portraying it.
No, there is no scientific consensus. That the scientists are divided. What scientists are concerned about, some scientists, the majority, but not by any means all of them, that there might be serious global warming in the future. If there is a problem, what is the sensible thing to do about it? And it is the measures that are put in place which we really have to focus on, and whether they make economic sense, whether they make scientific sense, whether they make political sense. And they don't, and which is why there is going to be no agreement whatever of any significance at Doha.
Isn't there a big danger here in what you're doing? Is just undermining the science, that in the end nothing might be done at all?
No, look, the science is very uncertain. It is quite clear that there is such a thing as the greenhouse effect, which means that the more carbon dioxide emissions that there are in the atmosphere, other things being equal, the warmer the planet will be. But two things are totally uncertain. Scientists admit it's uncertain, the good climate scientists admit it's uncertain, is how much warmer, and that is anyhow other things being equal. And of course other things are not equal. That is why there's been no warming so far this century, because there's been a rapid increase in carbon emissions and carbon concentration in the atmosphere, but other things have counteracted that. So the position is very unclear. But the point is, we use carbon energy, oil, gas, coal, not because we have a love affair with these particular forms of energy, but because they are far and away the cheapest source of energy at the present time. They have been for a very long time, and they're likely to remain so. Not forever, but for a very long time.
We've come to the very northern tip of Qatar, actually not far from the vast North Field, just over the horizon there. It's the third largest gas reserve in the world, and it's changed the very course of this desert nation. There is still evidence around about Qatar of the old world, but there's not much of it. Life in the modern nation is very different here, and for the most part, it's been an easy change to make. The irony is that those communities being forced to change their lives because of global warming blame the very fossil fuels that have powered the industrialized world and have made nations like Qatar rich. I travelled to the far north in the Arctic to assess the impact of global warming there. We're heading to the far north, to a place where once the sea was frozen all the year round. But not anymore. All around the Arctic, the effects of global warming are multiplying. This is a gigantic glacier tumbling off Greenland's ice sheet near ILULISSAT. It's hard to judge its size, but from top to bottom, that cliff face is 1.5 kilometers high. And it's moving, accelerating, and this in a year when nearly all the surface area of the Greenland ice cap melted.
The speeds that we're seeing at Jakobshavn are quite fast. We're seeing speeds up to, I think, about 60 meters a day, which is faster than was observed in the past. So there's definitely things speeding up, but it's not clear that it's directly related to that warming event that you saw earlier this summer. It may be related to warming events that took place a decade or more ago.
At sea level, the majesty of the Arctic is breathtaking. It is just spectacular, isn't it? You can see why this whole area is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you also get a real sense of the sheer scale, the sheer size of the Greenland ice cap. These colossal icebergs are just mere fragments of the ice sheet that have been toppling off into the ocean and are doing so in larger and larger numbers every year.
What we're seeing now is so much faster than anything anybody's seen before. It used to be in what they call geological time, you know, over many, many, many thousands of years.
Right.
Now we're seeing it in people's lifetimes. That's the difference.
We're already deep inside the Arctic Circle, but still we need to push 1,000 kilometers further north. This is Karnak, a community at the top of the world. To an outsider, things are very different here, where sled puppies chew on whale bones and children play in the midnight sun. Whale meat being cut up to feed sled dogs. There's little room for sentiment in the remote north. This is a way of life.
It's very important to me. In the winter, without dog, I'm nothing.
But this year, Mads had to shoot some of his dogs. The sea ice was so late coming, he couldn't hunt, and there was no food. And the ice gets thinner every year.
About 2.5 meters 10 years ago. Now it's only, only 1 meter.
Arctic life is very finely tuned. And although, as the Inuit say, winter will always come, it's getting shorter and shorter. The natural order is slowly but surely being turned upside down. There'll be another instalment of that trip in part 2 of our special programme, when we'll assess the impact global warming is having on Arctic wildlife. And we're in Brazil, where deforestation and global warming threatens the world's largest rainforest, the Amazon. Well, that's it for the first part of this Al Jazeera special programme. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye for now.